My grandfather was he was a drunk, and there was certainly maybe many other descriptors, negative, that could be said. And honestly, in a very tiny, small town, that didn't play out very well. I don't think it played out very well for my dad when he was growing up there, and certainly didn't play out well for me either. So I was just a kid, though, and I didn't really know all of this. I didn't really understand all of this. It was just the way it was. I didn't know anything else, so I guess it is what it is. And maybe I had like one other friend. I honestly look back on that, I was thinking about that even this morning. It was like, I think that kid was probably a social outcast himself, to be honest with you. I remember getting invited to 2 birthday parties those 5 years that I lived there. And I don't know if you remember those times, but man, those early years of elementary school, back in my day anyway, there was all different kinds of birthday parties that you'd get invited to, and it's kind of the social thing to do for a kid. I didn't have that. I certainly wasn't popular then as a result of my last name, and instead I got bullied. But I would stand up to bullies. Well, I got beat up, really, is what happened, because I was always the smallest in my class, and really bullies are usually the largest. Maybe some of you have stories like that as well. And maybe even now there's people who avoid you, who wouldn't help you if you were on fire and they were holding a bucket of water, right? But again, I was just a kid. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just caught up in just an unfair system. And thank the Lord that we moved after my 4th grade going into 5th grade. I certainly am not the only one who's ever suffered. And honestly, I kind of treat my suffering, a few bloody noses and whatnot, as kind of trivial back then. But we do live in a world where people judge one another, where people prejudge, and as a result of that judgment, they base how they're going to interact with others. People still today in our world will judge people by the color of their skin. More so even in our world today, since it's kind of global, it's just the fact of, oh, you're from one of those countries. And so we just struggle at times to interact with one another, treat one another well. Sometimes maybe it is our fault. Maybe we have made mistakes, and other people know that, and maybe they don't want to let us forget about it either, and maybe they don't want to associate with us as a result of that, or associate with anybody who then associates with us. I know when I was working with guys in prison, I could see this guy make this huge turnaround. And as he was getting out and rejoining society, I found out right away society didn't want them. In fact, they generally wanted to continue to punish them. And certainly they put up all kinds of roadblocks before these guys that really made it very difficult for them to rebuild a life now. Well, I'm here to tell you this morning, that God has a special place in His heart for those our world disregards, alienates. Our journey through this book of Matthew that we're in has brought us to chapter 8. So if you all of a sudden we're opening up your Bibles to chapter 5, since we just finished 4, just recognize we've already gone through 5, 6, and 7 previously, so we won't re-preach those, although, man, it would have made it a lot easier for me in preparations. But again, Jesus, those chapters, Jesus is known as the Sermon on the Mount, has taught about what this new kingdom looks like, and not just what it looks like in heaven, literally what it looks like now, today, as He was ushering in this this new kingdom. What would it look like? How would people act? How would people interact? And And honestly, there's a huge difference between what a person was and what a person would be after Jesus had stepped into their life. But Matthew here, all of a sudden, he's going to turn his attention in a different direction. He's going to turn his attention towards giving us a demonstration of the power that Jesus had. In these next two chapters, chapters 8 and 9, we'll see just this incredible demonstration of miracles by Jesus, and then a response or reaction follows each set. Jesus would demonstrate his power over sickness and nature and demons and even death. Matthew chooses then nine miracles out of just countless, right? As a matter of fact, we don't have listed all of the miracles that Jesus would perform. That's what John tells us. And so what Matthew is trying to say, what his point is through these incredible displays of Jesus' power, is that Jesus truly is, in fact, the Messiah. He's the promised one. He's announcing that hope has arrived. And Jesus will perform these miracles in plain sight for all to see. And I know we say seeing is believing, but believing what? Just because people see Jesus do some amazing, unexplainable things doesn't mean that people will just drop to their knees and worship him. Many would see these miracles and they would explain them away, which is exactly what so many people still do in our day. The first three miracles that we'll have a chance of looking at here over the next couple of weeks, these miracles deal with healing of a disease, affliction. You know, in the ancient world, disease just ran rampant. The conditions that so many people lived in were a bit unsanitary, and it just led to all different kinds of infections and diseases. And they didn't have the medicines or the treatments that we have today. Disease would literally just run its course, sometimes wiping out a whole village. Life expectancy was short. 35 years was the life expectancy during Jesus' day. And honestly, a lot of that had to do with the infant mortality rate being so high. But if you could make it to 20, chances are you could make it to maybe 40 and possibly even 50. But that's still quite low by our standards today, isn't it? At a time when if you contracted a disease or was born with something that there wasn't much hope, honestly, there was probably no hope for you in certain situations, Jesus steps onto the scene and begins healing people. Now, all of a sudden, Jesus represents hope to so many. People who just the day before had absolutely no hope. All of a sudden, there was just this chance of hope for their life. I remember, speaking of prison, I remember as I was walking across the yard at one of these prisons. It was a pretty rough place. And matter of fact, they normally didn't let people like myself walk across the yard without somebody. But I don't know, they let me. And this place had a lot of people who had murdered somebody. I always knew that when I did classes there and was working with guys, I always knew in that group there would always be at least a handful of guys who had taken somebody else's life. And somebody asked me one time, goes, "Hey, don't you fear? Aren't you afraid as you walk across the yard by yourself here?" And I said, "No, I'm not afraid." I said, everybody knows who I am, right? It's a small world there. Everybody knows who I am, whether they've been to my class or whatever. They know who I am, and I represent hope. And I always said, who wants to kill hope? I really hadn't thought that through totally, had I? Because we know that Jesus would be killed. That there's plenty of people who will try to kill off hope. And so we come to Matthew chapter 8 here, verses 1 through 4, and let's go through this together. It says, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount. And of course, as he's making his way back down off this mountainside, there's a lot of people following him. I mean, there was a lot of people who, if you see at the end of the book, they were just amazed. Amazed at his teaching, amazed at the authority in which that he spoke. When all of a sudden, in the midst of all of that, a leprous man approaches him. Now again, leprosy today, also known as Hansen's disease, is an infection. You catch that by slow-growing bacteria, and it can affect nerves, skin, eyes, lining of the nose. The nerve damage can result in crippling of hands and feet, and paralysis, blindness. Today, leprosy, if it has an early diagnosis and treatment, it can be cured. People can even continue to work and lead an active life during and after treatment. We know today that it really isn't all that easily spread from person to person, that it takes a prolonged exposure of close contact over months to become affected generally. Today, it's cured with an antibiotic. In the U.S., it's pretty rare, less than 200 cases, which I still think that sounds high, but I realize it's a large nation. Less than 200 cases a year are reported, and most of those cases became infected in a country where it's more common. But in the ancient world, people feared leprosy. There was certainly no early detection, and even if there was, there's no medicine. So the disease would simply run its course, eventually causing disfigurement, loss of limbs, eyesight. It was pretty horrific in the ancient world. The term used that we see here for leprosy in the New Testament was just a general reference to seemingly incurable skin infections. It could have included the formal affliction that we call Hansen's disease or any other severe skin disease with inflammation. By Mosaic law, I don't know if some of you are tracking through with us, not just maybe going through the book of Proverbs, which I hope that you are, but maybe some others have taken on the whole, hey, let's read through the Bible. And in Leviticus 13, I don't know, I'm really far ahead in my reading right now, so I'm not quite sure if everybody's there yet, but I can remember reading this here just a few days ago. But in the Mosaic law, you didn't go to a doctor. You went to the priests. They were charged with diagnosing leprosy in people. And so in Leviticus 13, you can see this. And so someone, at times, they would try to treat the disease. Maybe they might use various baths or ointments or mixtures or herbs and oils applied to the skin. But the process of diagnosing leprosy went something like this. A person with a serious skin infection would go to the priest to be examined. The priest would look to see if the infection had penetrated the skin or if the hair in the affected area had turned white. And if so, they would declare that person unclean. If not, a 7-day quarantine was instituted with a new examination for leprosy then scheduled afterwards. Being diagnosed with leprosy, don't miss this, being Being diagnosed with leprosy was a death sentence. It was a death sentence physically, but it was also a death sentence socially, economically, spiritually. In the rabbinic tradition, they held that curing leprosy was as difficult as raising the dead. Perhaps because they saw the disease as the typical manifestation of sin's consequences. You see, a leper was considered physically unclean and contagious, as well as spiritually unclean. That meant this leper was completely shunned from normal activities of community life and barred from inclusion in worship in the temple or any synagogue. Leper couldn't hold a job, couldn't live in a home with lepers, including even his own family. Couldn't shop in a market, couldn't own property, couldn't touch or hug, hold hands, nothing. A leper had to stay 6 feet away from everyone else unless the wind was blowing, and then it was even further depending on the direction of the other people. They had to wear clothes that were unkept. They weren't able to fix their hair. They had to let everyone know that they were a leper. It had to be humiliating, especially at the very beginning. The leper's only option was begging for scraps, was severe isolation, and honestly just waiting to physically deteriorate and die. With all this in mind, okay, I need to say all this. With all this in mind, a leper approaches Jesus amongst the crowd, nonetheless. And he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." A couple things we should probably note about this guy. Number one is this: he took a big risk. Didn't he? He took a big risk. I mean, getting this close to Jesus and the crowd, whether he sensed maybe there was something different about Jesus, about how he cared for people, or he was just desperate. We don't necessarily know, but again, sometimes desperate times, desperate measures. And he knew hope was available. And so he takes this risk. Because in other scenarios, this guy might just be stoned to death for taking this kind of risk, getting this close to so many people. And so he took a risk. He also, though, comes with a sense of reverence. I'm not saying that he was worshiping Jesus as he knelt there. I'm not saying that he worshiped him. I'm just saying that he didn't forego the niceties of his day. You see, when you would come upon a rabbi, they showed respect. And they would kneel before them. I mention this because how often do we honestly cut somebody some slack that's sick and forgo a bunch of the niceties? I get it, you're not feeling well. And yet this guy, at this moment, decides, hey, I'm not forgoing some respect. Respect needs to be paid, and he does. But he also comes with not just respect, he comes with humility. He says, if you are willing. He doesn't make demands of Jesus. Not any kind of demand. He simply just asks, if you're willing, could you help this person? But I tell you what, he doesn't just come with humility. He comes in faith. You see, there's no doubt in his mind that you can make me clean. If you're willing, if you want to, I know without a shadow of a doubt that you could heal me. What an amazing amount of faith this leper has. If you're willing, though, I mean, this guy was just used to people doing what? Passing him by. Jesus, will you be that guy to just pass me by? I'm sure there was plenty of people who wouldn't even look this guy eye to eye. They didn't want to get involved. They didn't even want to throw this guy a scrap. I kind of liken this probably sometimes to people who are homeless, who are standing out on a corner looking for some scraps. But what is Jesus' reaction? Would he ignore? Would he just walk by like everyone else? In fact, not just walk by, but realize who this is and just walk to the other side of the path away from this guy? Or would he recognize this guy as a leper and call him out? Tell him how horrible he was? That his sin had caused this affliction he was now suffering? Again, that's what this guy was used to hearing all of his life. Or would Jesus heal him? And Jesus' response to this man's plea is straight out bizarre. It's outlandish. It's even risky. It is definitely completely unexpected. Because what does Jesus do? He reaches out and touches this leprous man. He touches him. It had to startle him. I mean, can you imagine? Forget, it didn't just startle him. You know there was just some gasps going on when he touched, and everybody around him said, oh, what did he just do? No way did Jesus just touch this guy. I love this. Jesus touches the untouchable. That's who Jesus is. This guy hadn't been touched in so long. Not a handshake, not a hug, not a kiss. Someone hadn't even accidentally bumped into him or brushed up beside him. Everyone was scared. And here is Jesus reaching out and touching this man. Touching him when he didn't have to. You understand that, right? Jesus, he didn't have to touch him to heal him. We certainly know in other cases, Jesus just said a word and the miracle happened. I can think of even one case where Jesus healed from a distance of 20 some miles. Jesus could just say something and a person could just be healed. And yet, in this case, Jesus reaches out and touches him. And while we know that generally just reaching out and touching somebody with leprosy, that's not going to all of a sudden give you leprosy. They didn't know that. And really, since the term that we have here for leprosy is used for a whole host of skin diseases, maybe the one that he had was very contagious and infectious to others. But you see, Jesus wasn't fazed by this at all. He didn't let fear keep him from reaching out and touching the leper. Jesus didn't let the fact that by touching this leper, Jesus himself would become ceremonially unclean, if only for a period of time. But others, surely after Jesus would touch them, surely there'd be some that go, maybe I should take a few steps back from Jesus as well. Maybe some people start distancing themselves from him. But again, Jesus didn't let any of that keep him from reaching out and touching this leprous man. I mean, here's a true statement, though. At Jesus' touch, nothing remains defiled. You see, Jesus makes the unclean clean, just at his touch, just at his word. And so Jesus reaches out and touches the man and says, I am willing. Be clean. And the man was. He was clean. He was completely healed in an instant. Immediately. Immediately. Can you just imagine the transformation of taking? Again, this person was probably deformed, maybe missing some digits. And all of a sudden, you take another look at this guy, and all of a sudden, everything is clear. Everything is healed. He's brand new. This guy's life obviously changed completely in just an instant. His life would never be the same again. Never. This man's miserable existence is changed at Jesus' touch. At just a word from Jesus. No longer would this guy have to live in isolation. No longer would he have to say those humiliating words as he approached people. Unclean! Unclean! For the first time in a long time, he could brush through his hair, straighten up his attire, even go shopping for a new set of clothes, shake a hand, give a high five, a hug. He was clean. Jesus then tells the former leper to not tell anyone, but to go show himself to the priest. Remember, Mosaic law, there was a process. And he needed to go show himself to the priest. And why would Jesus want him to do this? Because Jesus knew this was the way this guy could re-enter society. Again, he's been shunned, not allowed to be around anyone. And he needed the priest to say everything was A-okay. He needed the priest to confirm he was indeed clean. Mark will tell us in his book that this guy wasn't obedient, all right? And he started blabbing it all over the place. Started telling everybody about what had happened. Instead of making a beeline for the priest, he just starts going from person to person to person. And I get it. That kind of news is pretty hard to contain, isn't it? I recognize there's a lot of witnesses to these miracles. And surely they would begin to tell others as well. But there's nothing like a person who's truly experienced it for themselves. For them to want to go and tell everyone. This guy literally had gone from having to shout, unclean, to again now as he approaches people, and they remember him from before, he looks way different, but he gets to shout, clean! Listen, I'm healed! And I bet you this guy embraced as many people as he possibly could. The leprosy in the Bible is a graphic illustration of sin's destructive power. You see, it infects the whole person. It's ugly, loathsome, corrupting, contaminating, alienating, and incurable by man. But no matter what, then, your sin, the point is, no matter what, no matter how egregious, no matter how humiliating, Jesus is still in the business of reaching out and touching a person and them finding healing. Still today, those who come to Jesus in faith, believing in Him, knowing that He can heal and forgive them of their sin, find a new life, a life changed in and through Jesus, beginning now and lasting forever. Simple question is this: how do people today find this kind of healing? The answer is pretty simple. It's pretty simple. They find healing through you and me, sharing the incredible good news with others. Now, I get this part, that most people that we talk to They don't even know they're sick. They don't know necessarily about their sin and how it's ultimately going to lead not just to death, but eternally separated from God. And they don't always recognize the depth of what that sin means and its effects upon their everyday lives right here and now. You and I do. We understand this. We're not just eyewitnesses and seeing it in someone else. We don't just know about the good news or even just about the bad news. We've experienced this miracle firsthand. Jesus reached out to us. Jesus reached out to us, and we responded in faith. And how did Jesus reach out to us? Generally through someone else, wasn't it? I've heard so many of your stories. Some of you, it was because of a parent who, as I heard one pastor say, he had a drug problem from early on. His parents drug him to church, right? Others of you, though, it was from a friend. A friend would be bold enough to share with you about Jesus Christ. And whether you took that at face value or not at the beginning, something happened in that moment that began your path towards where you are today with this relationship with Jesus Christ. And so we have to go. We get to go. God has cured us, and we are clean, healed. We really can't keep that to ourselves, can we? We know what is on the line. We can't just ignore people, allow them to just continue in their isolation from God, deteriorate, and die. Die without Christ. So how can you find this healing, this salvation? Again, who can find healing? And it doesn't make a difference how bad you've messed up. It doesn't make a difference how good of a life you think that you've lived. We all deal with sin. And no matter how little or how much, we need Jesus' touch. And he offers it to who? To everyone. So let's start with the people we know. Let's start with the people who matter the most to us. Let's start with the people who, honestly, we just bump into. Let's tell them the good. Let's tell them our story. You have a story to tell. Next week, some people are going to tell some stories about what God has done in their life. Here recently. Not 20, not 30 years ago, but recently. You have a story to tell. How excited are you about Jesus and what he has done in your life? How many times do I hear people say, I don't know how that person goes on without the hope that we experience in Jesus Christ? I can't tell you how many times I've heard that phrase over and over and over again. I'll tell you what, you ready for this? I don't know. And so many people don't move on as a result. But you have hope. The message that we have is to give them hope. And that's what we can do. We can tell them about the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus, he still cures the incurable. He healed me. He's healed you. And he is willing to heal those that you tell. I know some will reject it. Some will deny even your story. That it didn't happen that way. Of course they will. Jesus healed people, shared the good news with people, and many, if not most, would reject him. Why would we expect anything different today? But Jesus still shared in spite of that. In spite of the fact that literally he would be laying his own life on the line and recognizing so many would just reject him. Can you imagine the weight of that? We struggle at times with the weight of somebody rejecting us as we share that story. And we certainly don't have as much on the line as what Jesus did. But we do know what's at stake for that other person. You see, we understand what's taking place in their life. I think maybe I've shared this before, but I used to take students to a conference every year, and the main person that started this whole ministry about sharing your faith, when he was, I think he was just 16, had come to know Christ and was just on fire for the Lord. And as a part of his discipleship process, this mentor in his life just asked him to go to the mall and sit down on a seat. Remember when malls were popular? That was then. And he's just sitting there on a bench, just watching people go by for an hour or so. Just watching people go by. And his mentor just told him to think this one thought: that person's probably going to hell. That person probably doesn't know Jesus. Is that not the truth? It's the truth. And all of a sudden, after a while of doing that, he started having tears that ran down his face. Sometimes we forget. Sometimes we forget where we've come from. And sometimes we forget the condition that other people are still in. And yet we have the hope. The hope of Jesus Christ residing inside of us. And Jesus is still in the business of healing. I get it at times. Sure, he still heals people from disease, the temporary. But even better yet, Jesus is still healing people from their sin, offering salvation, a new life in him. I'll tell you what, when you come clean with God, honestly, when you come clean with God, he can truly make you clean. He can change your shout of unclean to a shout of clean. He can turn literally your humiliation away into a shout of victory. You've experienced it. I've experienced it. And we need to tell others so they can experience it too. No one has to be on the outside looking in. Jesus has made a way. Jesus is the way. And Jesus is still curing the incurable. Let's stand. Let's pray.